afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us at today's Inclusion Exchange. Today's Inclusion Exchange is themed around Pride Month, and we're going to be talking about how to elevate transgender experience in the workplace. And I'm really excited to have a fantastic guest speaker with us today to have a conversation really about what some of the challenges are within the transgender community and within the wider workforce that we can overcome when we look at improving the experience of people within the workplace. So really excited to bring to you today's session. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Eva Echo, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the founder and managing director of Advocacy Bali. And we are a management consultancy organisation. We're based in Liverpool, and we essentially work with organisations to provide learning and development, EDI, strategic advice and action planning, and also mentoring and coaching support for really the people who are doing the do within organisations and trying to create that visible change, particularly for marginalised groups within the workplace who face discrimination or challenges around progression and retention. So when we set up the business, one of the things we absolutely wanted to do was to create a free platform really to bring people together, to create a sense of community, because we know how hard this work is. We know what the external challenges are, we know what the internal challenges are, and sometimes bringing people together to share best practice and to learn from others in different sectors who are really making some leeway and setting the groundwork out, we find it really useful and useful for our own resilience really as EDI practitioners as well. So whether you're working in EDI, whether you're a chief exec, an HR professional, or a staff network lead, or just someone interested in how to improve the workplace environment to create more equity, we hope that this session will be useful to you and you'll be able to go away, hopefully with something that sticks with you around practical changes that you can make or conversations that you might want to change, might want to have within your community or your workplace setting. That's the aim of it. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I've been wanting to do a session focused on transgender inclusion for some time. I'm personally very focused on social justice and elevating the voices, particularly of those that are most marginalised within society. And I think certainly the stats tell us and our experiences in society tell us that the transgender community is one of the most marginalised communities that we work with at the moment. So really proud to bring a session really focused and highlighting some of those key issues. So I wouldn't be able to do this myself. The only way that I can have this conversation is by bringing in someone with experience, professional experience, and a real track record of doing and focusing on transgender inclusion. So I'm really pleased to introduce our guest speaker today by just sharing a little bit of information with you now. So for those of you that don't know Eva, Eva Echo is an activist, a writer and a public speaker with a focus on transgender rights and specifically mental health issues. And she uses her own experiences to shed a light on what it is to be transgender and really to challenge some of the obstacles that gender diverse people face within today's society. Most notably, Eva took legal action against NHS England in the High Court to challenge some of the unlawful waiting times that faced transgender patients. She won the Diva Award for Unsung Hero of the Year 2022 and was named on the Diva Power List. So we're in for a real treat. I'm so excited to speak to Eva today. More recently though, Eva won Trans in the City's Trans Community Champion Award for 2022. And you might also be aware that Eva is Director of Innovation at Birmingham Pride. We were just having a chat just now. I think that she's been doing a lot of work on Birmingham Pride recently, which is really fascinating. She also sits on the Crown Prosecution Service's Hate Crime Panel, and she's also a brand ambassador for the London Transgender Clinic. So really excited to have you on board, Eva. If you would like to come onto the podcast, you are so welcome. How are you doing? You okay?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Oh no, it's such a pleasure. Really excited to get into this conversation. And I think those of you who've kind of joined these conversations previously will know that these hours fly. We've got a number of questions that we put together to ask you, Eva. But for anyone in the audience who wants to ask questions throughout, please do feel free to post those in the Q&A box. I'll try and get round to as many as possible throughout the hour as well. But yeah, great to have you on board, Eva, and to learn from you and from your experiences would be great. But as is traditional for these podcasts, I just want to start really to just find out a little bit more about you as a person. So what are your origins? How did you get into this amazing area of work? So just tell us a little bit more about you.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I came out about 6 years ago now at the ripe old age of 37. So don't let this round and wholesome face fool you. And I kind of quickly realized that, after spending much of my life kind of oppressing myself, not allowing myself to be me, not allowing myself to kind of explore who I am, just literally going from one role to another and just being incredibly unhappy, thinking, well, I can't be the only one. And when I came out, I started to write a blog, and quite naively, I thought, no one's going to read a blog on the internet. There are millions of pages online. Why would anyone read mine? And people did. And that's when I realized I wasn't the only one. And when I came out as transgender, that was following a UK tour. I used to be a musician. And for me, that was a pivotal moment, because I thought, as a musician, that's the dream. That's what you want to aim for. And I was sat on stage behind a drum kit night after night, really hating it, because I was acutely aware that the audience saw a version of me that I'd spent time crafting. It wasn't the real me, and I felt a fraud, a complete fake. So that really prompted me to do a lot of soul searching after tour finished. And I realized I'm trans. I always have been, and I can't get away from it. So let's embrace it. Let's give this role a chance, in the same way that I'd given previous roles a chance trying to fit in. Let's embrace this. So I originally thought, I'm just going to transition and then I'm going to go back to what I do. But again, that was quite naive, because the more I spoke to other people, the more I realized that we had shared struggles and that it couldn't just be about me. And that's kind of how I fell into activism, because I'm quite stubborn when it comes to changes and like social injustices. So, but yeah, if I can do something for others, why not?
Thank you. No, that's so useful, just to find out how you got into it, I suppose, and also from your own personal experience of coming out as well. So was at that time, was it difficult to actually get into the activism side around dealing with your own kind of coming out journey, or how did you get through that particular period to transition that way?
It's weird. Like, I think, as I say, I think I fell into activism. I don't think anyone really set out to get into it, because it usually comes from recognition that things aren't right and not enough people are doing anything about it. So why not be that change? Why not roll sleeves up and let's mobilize, let's do something? And I felt that I was in a privileged position, being self-employed at that time. I wasn't restricted by 9 to 5 jobs where I had to focus, and give so much time to a company. I thought, well, I can dabble here and there. I can get involved in some charity work. I can speak to people. I can organize little things myself, and do things that way. And I guess from there, it kind of spiraled. I started working with more and more organizations. And my partner and I used to have a tattoo studio. So when we closed that during lockdown, I made that decision then to take a step away from tattooing and like that side of life, and really come back on the other side, dedicating my energy completely to doing what I do.
Mm.
And it was a case of, I mean, I wouldn't even say I needed to go and find work, because there are so many things that we're struggling with as a community, that it was a case of somebody needed help. I would put my hand up and I'd say, I'm happy to help you out. What can we do? Let's work together. And then, yeah, it just kind of went from there. And I would just go around helping people out. And that's always how I've been, really. I hate to see others struggle.
Yeah, no, I think certainly from my own perspective as well, I think there's some catharsis as well sometimes. I think when you can support other people with that particular challenge. So yeah, useful to see kind of how that played out for you as well.
I think it helps to externalize like your own struggle. It helps you put that into context, into perspective, especially in the community around you. And the win is that you're not just helping yourself, you're helping everybody as well.
Yeah.
So it's a really great way to move forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So just in terms of what we're going to be discussing today, Eva, I'm really keen to get your view, I suppose, on the transgender inclusion agenda, if we want to call it that, in workplaces across the UK. There's been, I mean, I work obviously within EDI, I work with colleagues in EDI, and I think do a lot of work around improving a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, and highlighting some of the challenges that face different groups within the protected characteristics. And I think that there's been there's been a dialogue around transgender rights that's been quite difficult. I think it's fair to say, as a understatement, over the last few years in relation to the external pressures and the anti-wokeism. I just wondered what is your perspective on how the transgender inclusion agenda is within what we do around EDI? Do you think there's enough of a focus? Do you think there's still work to be done? What's your view on how we actually talk about these issues in the wider context?
I think we're kind of scratching the surface at the moment, because it's great to see more and more people putting pronouns in their bio, for example. Some people even have a little link saying, why am I putting my pronouns in there? So it's great that we're doing that in order to normalize this idea of pronouns. But I feel that we need to do more, because there is a statistic about 4 years ago that 1 in 3 employers wouldn't hire an openly out trans person, purely because they wouldn't want the culture within the workplace to be rocked by this person coming in. And trans people, if they can avoid it, don't want to be out at work. There's a lot of misgendering, there's a lot of transphobia, a lot of even just things like little digs, little things here or there. We spend so much of our life at work that it's we need to do more to include those people. Our work family, we spend so much time with, and we're all thrown together. It's not like we audition for these families, and it's not like we get to know who these people are before. We are thrown together because we are there to do a job. And I think the more that we can support each other in achieving that goal and doing that job, everybody prospers. So to do more, such as gender neutral toilets, even just little things like that, can say to a member of the trans community at work, we hear you, we see you, there are facilities for you. Having sanitary towel bins in every toilet, again, is just a little way of saying we understand, and here you are. It doesn't have to be massive policy changes, and certainly no one's throwing it in anybody's faces. I mean, I hear a lot about this idea that, oh, you're trans, that's fine, but you don't have to keep throwing this wokeism in our faces. You don't have to keep putting it out there and forcing us to share this experience. But when we look at the media, the trans voices aren't platformed at all. When we look at, say, the Telegraph, the Times, papers like that, where we can literally count how many anti-trans articles there are per week versus how many there are, pro-trans, and it's shockingly disproportionate. So the voices that are really talking about trans at the moment aren't the pro-trans voices. So perhaps when you hear too much about trans, it's not coming from the right area, which is why, areas like ED&I are so important, to really speak to people about the actual message, about who trans people really are, what their struggles are about, so that we can hear the truth and we can find ways forward together, rather than just kind of getting lost in the mix of all this misinformation that's out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's about kind of being evidence-based with all of this, because I think there's a lot of kind of dog whistles, there's a lot of just false narratives, I think, around the transgender experience. And I think when I look back, particularly in history, and you look about kind of struggles around equality and social justice for other groups in society, I almost feel like with the transgender issues at the moment, it's like we're not learning from the mistakes of our past. I think there's many examples that we can look at with the gay rights movement, with the disability movement, with race equality movement, where at the beginnings it was a taboo, the basics were not right within the workplace, things were seen as acceptable around microaggressions, direct abuse and discrimination. But it feels like perhaps transgender issues are one of the last kind of unspoken taboos, really, where it is seen as somehow reasonable or misunderstood enough to kind of let things go. I don't know from your perspective if you see that within the rhetoric around transgender.
Definitely,
perhaps it's not. Is it on an equal playing field when we look at the other groups that are protected by law? It's a question mark for me.
I think, I mean, like, look at Section 28 back in the 80s. The idea that LGBTQ plus materials could not be taught. And we're almost seeing that now, like over in the US, books are being banned left, right, and center, to the point where in one particular state, they accidentally had to ban the Bible because it went against their own legislation. So it's like, we clearly haven't learned those lessons. Look at the AIDS HIV situation back in the 80s, where people were demonized for having AIDS, HIV. And those people that were suffering just needed support. But instead, we had a society that was blaming them, that was spreading lies and misinformation. And it's the same thing all over again. People are talked about, but no, the actual people involved aren't really heard. So it's absolutely vital that we cut through all that noise and really get to the heart of it. Because I guess the way I see it, I can understand why people look at trans people or the idea of a trans person and think, this is so wacky, so far removed that a person would change gender. It's not like someone who comes out as lesbian or gay, they're pretty much that, they look the same. It doesn't affect the job or anything or anything on the outside. But to be trans and to be out as trans, you have to physically challenge every single person you see. You're challenging their perception of what it is to be a man or a woman. And people can take offense to that. People take that very personally because you're making them think. If I was to come out as lesbian, it really doesn't have anything to do with anybody else because, yes, there's the homophobia, there's the lesbophobia that goes along with it. But by and large, my sexuality does not challenge or impact anybody else beyond, does that mean you fancy me now or anything like that? But being trans, we are challenging people. It's not just our journey, it's society's journey along with us. And in doing so, we're actually forcing society to really reevaluate itself, because for decades now, we have been following these unwritten rules, such as blue is for boys, pink is for girls, the societal constructs that, we have to live in a certain way, we have to think in a certain way. And suddenly, you've got a group of people, a community who are like, what, screw that, this is who we are. And it goes outside of this bubble that we're so used to. And if anyone that's seen the film The Matrix, which is a fantastic way of looking at that, where you step outside that bubble and you see the world for how it is. And it's not just the trans community. I think when we look at social injustice as a whole, it's not that there's these lefty lawyers or wokeism. Quite simply, this veil over our eyes has been lifted gradually, and we're seeing the world as it truly is. We're starting to ask more questions rather than readily accept blue is for boys, pink is for girls, and things like that. So, yeah, a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but we can really cut to the chase if we just look back in history and think, this is basically a repackaged version of a movement back then. Why do we not learn those lessons? Why are we still doing this dance to get to the ending? Let's recognize that we could save ourselves years of hardship, years of trauma and hurt, if we just recognize the similarities and move on.
Would absolutely agree with that. And I think, it makes absolute sense. It makes, obviously, it's landing with me. I think that the challenge is when you're working within contexts where people perhaps just don't seem to get it. There's a massive block there. So I'm curious to get what's your perspective, what's your view on how do we take other people with us who have a completely different perspective, who don't see the world in which we see it, in the way that we see it? Like how do you have that dialogue with people who are coming from a completely different and polarized view? If that's something that you've done.
Yeah, all the time, especially
yeah.
I mean, we've got to make space. I mean, using Twitter as an example, I recognize when there are those engagements where the person on the other end is not willing to learn. They're not in this engagement to learn. They don't want to. They have a set of opinion, and all they want to do is talk at you. And we need to recognize that in those engagements, we just walk away because there's no value. There's nothing that we can actually do. The engagements we need to look for are those who are willing to listen. Like, for example, people attending today who thought, this is an area that I've heard about, I'd like to learn more. Let's have that open dialogue, but let's let either side speak equally, because right now it's very heavily steeped towards this national, even international conversation where it's 99% anti-trans, and the 1% who are trying to speak aren't even trans. It's our allies who are having to speak for us. So we need to give equal time and space to both sides to be heard. but then find ways forward. And we have to be open-minded towards change. And that's the only way that we can move forward, because otherwise we'll always have this conflict where it's one view against another. Well, that's great. You are open to your own views, but how does that move forward? Because there is freedom of speech, and there is a lot of talk about freedom of speech these days and how that itself can be protected as a characteristic. But we must remember that you are entitled to freedom of speech, but the moment that freedom of speech crosses a line and it impacts on somebody else who may also be a protected characteristic, that's when it's no longer freedom of speech. That's when, your words can potentially incite, it can create and stir up hate. We only have to look at hate crime. Last year, it was announced by the Home Office that transphobic hate crime had increased by 56% in a 12-month period. And that comes through all this negative discourse that we're hearing constantly. And when you hear it from the top, in people within power, those in places of responsibility, it makes us think, it's okay for us to use that language, and it becomes ingrained. And sooner or later, people act upon those words as well, and those values, because it becomes this almost a sense of, I don't know, being a hero, trying to protect society from something. Well, you're trying to protect society from me, but let's look at the statistics. Am I really a threat? Have I created this? Have I committed this? Statistically, and when we look at the evidence, and that's a no. Looking at the gender recognition reform that took place in Scotland at the end of last year, that was passed, right through to it being blocked from royal assent this year, there was a lot of talk about this idea of gender recognition reform damaging or taking away from cisgender women's rights. But in actual fact, it doesn't. The actual piece of legislation is specifically looking at legal recognition of a person's gender. So, for example, it's a very administrative procedure. All that legislation does is allow for a trans person to update their birth certificate, to die with dignity by having the correct details on their death certificate, to marry under the correct gender, and depending where you are, to also retire at the correct age, although that's not really a thing these days with the retirement age kind of matching anyway. But that's all it is. But all of a sudden it became, access to single-sex spaces, that, people taking advantage of this in order to commit violence against women and girls. But when we look at it internationally, there have been no known documented cases. Last year, Argentina, they celebrated the 10th anniversary of self-ID, which is their version of Scotland's gender recognition reform. Not a single incident of anybody abusing that process to commit violence against women and girls. It's all just misinformation. In fact, access to single-sex spaces is actually governed by the Equality Act, not the Gender Recognition Act itself. So it's being able to sift through the facts and really supporting it with the figures. And we've got like 15, 16 countries now who adopt the same model, not a single one. I mean, we only have to look over the channel to Ireland, our closest neighbour. They've had this in place since 2015, not a single case of it being abused. So in fact, it's allowed trans people to carry on, to move forward. And the fact is, when we look at it in the workplace, if you've got an employee who can be themselves, who can express who they are, they're going to be a lot more productive. And when we've got colleagues around them who support them, allow them to thrive, the whole workforce itself moves forward together and is much more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the case there, I think morally and in terms of the business case, it is really clear. It feels that there is still a way to go in terms of, I suppose, that visible almost policy line for organisations and service providers to say that this is what the stance is on trans and non-binary inclusion, to make sure that staff feel confident to get behind that and to understand how their organisation relate to a lot of the noise that's going on in kind of the wider environment, really, socially. Yeah. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, when it comes to employers, when it comes to service providers, because I know that you've done some work obviously with NHS England to look at trans rights there. What role do organisations have in terms of highlighting this as an issue and dispelling some of the myths and misinformation that's out there? Whose role is it really to push this forward?
I would say it's everybody's role. I mean, the thing is, we when you hear stories, on your Instagram feed, or whether it's on the news or anything like that, you don't really have an opposing view. You just kind of take it for granted that that's information. But allowing people to engage with it is incredibly important, allowing people to ask questions and have experts there to ask questions too. And that's why, sessions like this are incredibly important, but also sessions in the workplace, because again, as I said, we spend so much time at work. For employers to really invite people in to talk about lived experiences, the more we can then share those experiences and normalize them, because it's not a shock. Let's look at tattoos. 50 years ago, if you told someone you had a tattoo, you'd be met with, why would you do that to yourself? Did it hurt? What if you had? Let's have a look. And now, statistically, 1 in 4 people have a tattoo. If you told someone, oh, I've got a tattoo, you'd be met with, so who hasn't? It's not new. It's not scandalous. It's not salacious anymore. So the more we can normalize it through visibility, through talking about it, the better. And in a workplace, it's an ideal environment where we can target so many groups of people together and really talk about it in a safe environment, and kind of allow employees to hold their, the hands of their employees and move forward and say, look, we understand that there are certain groups where they may challenge your perceptions, but that's fine. Let's work through it together, and we'll explore that, and we'll support you if you have any questions. But we've got to do it that way. And I think when we look at the workplace, there is too much in terms of policy, because policies are great. They create the boundaries of what we should be working towards, and also, what we shouldn't be doing. But a lot of people seem to see policies as rules, and people don't like being told what to do. People hate it. And the moment you come across as enforcing trans inclusion, straight away that there will be groups of people who are like, well, why do they get all the focus right now? Why are they getting the special treatment? But it's not that. It's just their idea of, well, we're doing this to include them, and this is why we need to include them. We need to focus on the why, not just throw out a policy and say, well, here's our trans inclusion policy, off we go. If anything, the trans inclusion policies need to be for attracting potential members of staff to come and join the company, allowing existing members of staff who are trans to understand that they do have the support of the company. It's not there to say to other members of staff, look what these people are getting over you. It's definitely not that way. And I think the more we can reframe that, the more we can move forward together, because otherwise there will always be this divide. And it'll be the same within any group. For example, I used to work with somebody in a 9-to-5 job who had lupus, and she needed a lot of additional support and time off. And there were still people saying, why is it she's able to do this when it comes to break times? Why is she allowed that flexibility? Well, she has certain needs. And, the same with accessibility needs. We've got to make allowances for that. It's not just the case of, well, if they want it, I need it as well. We have to ask, do you really need it?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what you spoke about there, it just chimes into, again, the historical and the current resistance we get across the board sometimes when looking at positive action, which is something that's encouraged through the Equality Act around, positively striving to recruit people from different backgrounds and ensure that they're accommodated, to ensure that the organisation is fair and just. It's almost like the basics.
Yeah.
And one thing that I'd love to pull out of this conversation is, and I think you mentioned the importance of pronouns, and I think that there's a bit more acceptance on that. I think still there's some resistance, still some people who don't get it, but I'm interested to know from your perspective on how we can move past that, if we're at the stage to move past that at the moment.
I think we are. Yeah.
And also, because again, another thing that I think about regularly is representation. And I can't think of one senior leader that I've ever come across that I've known to be kind of trans or non-binary. I think we need to be talking about some of these issues about wider representation within the workforce and voice from a almost a power dynamic perspective as well. So just curious to get your perspective on that really as well.
Yeah, I think from that, we when we look at the workplace culture, I think ultimately that needs changing, because it's traditionally we go to work 9 to 5, we do the same thing, we come back, and the culture is quite stale. The workplace cultures that we see around the country now are very similar, if we remove the HR, the policy element, very similar to workplace cultures 20, 30 years ago, where we now need to look at the actual culture itself and say, how nurturing are we? How inclusive are we as a workplace family? And it really does need those at the top putting their faith and recognizing that trans people or anybody from any protected characteristic is capable of doing the job and putting their faith in allowing them the chance to do that. And really stepping up and saying, I'm going to make this happen. I mean, using myself as an example, Birmingham Pride, the senior leadership team is made up of, I'd probably say, one of the most diverse teams for a Pride. We've got everybody covered. And that decision was made consciously. It wasn't a tick box exercise. It was a simple case of the festival director saying, well, times are moving. We're the older generation. We need to be able to see what the new generation want, but at the same time, look at it through an intersectional lens. So let's now bring on a new team that's able to kind of carry that on and also reach those people that we ourselves could never reach because we don't have that lived experience. And that's what we need leaders to do, to empower those who are from marginalized backgrounds. And going back to tattoos, the more we see that, the more we get used to it. Because otherwise, if we don't have the right culture in place, putting someone who is trans as a person of authority, as a leader, that will instantly get friction and challenge from the rest of the workforce. So it's crucial that we start with the culture first. Once the culture is accepting and inclusive, then we can start doing those changes and putting people in power, and then really starting to change. And it takes people to really stand up and go, you know what, I'm not afraid to go against the grain. And there will be some hate initially, but let's stick with it. And let's look at Pride Month. I mean, Pride is all year round, but Pride Month, June is internationally seen as Pride Month. There are brands that support the LGBTQ plus community, but the moment things get difficult, they back away. Look at Innocent Smoothies recently. They tweeted support for the trans community. The moment that attracted a lot of hate, they deleted the tweet, put a post up about why they deleted it. And their support seems to have just withered away. Now, we need someone to stand there and go, yes, there is hate, but we stand firm in what we believe. And then a great example of that is Halifax, when they said that they're allowing their employees to wear pronouns in their name badges. It was entirely optional. Twitter got bent out of shape completely. Everyone's saying, this is too woke now. It's just a bank. But the fundamental point is they allowed staff members as an option. It wasn't forced. They weren't forcing it on customers. And when there was all this hate targeted at Halifax for it, Halifax stood firm and said, this is what we believe in. We're doing this as an option to allow our members of staff to express and be who they are within the workplace. If you don't like it, you're welcome to take your account and your money elsewhere. That's the firm stance we need. And the more we have organizations taking that firm stance, the more it doesn't seem like a scary thing to be doing, to go against the grain. You've got that solidarity amongst your allies.
I love that. And those examples are really powerful as well. And I've been kind of following a few stories over the last few months where brands have been pulling back, and it's not good. And I think it sends a clear message to staff as well, who are from the LGBTQI plus community. They cannot be removed from the situation. They're not going to change their identity because there's been a media storm. So it's about how do we stand firm to that principle around inclusion, and how do we develop a line on it that is based on evidence? Because I think when we do that, it's very easy to fall back and say, well, actually, this is why we think this is important. But you have to, I think, spend a bit of time investing in how kind of trans inclusion or any inclusion relates to your values, and have that really is almost embedded into your vision as an organisation, really, to keep that really strong stance. But it is difficult, and I think it is really challenging for leaders when they're unaware as well. They're not aware of something that's just kind of completely blown up. And I think that's when there's sometimes some fear around progressing this agenda because of that fear of getting it wrong, or fear of something coming back as negative press. So yeah, interesting to see a couple of examples of brands who've been able to weather that, because it's really important in terms of how we actually move forward. So yeah, cool. So I wanted to ask you another question, and just to say in terms of the audience as well, we haven't had any questions yet, but please do feel free. If you've got anything you would like to ask Eva, I am checking the questions and I'd be happy to put your questions to Eva as well. But yeah, I just wanted to make reference, I suppose, and you've made reference to quite a bit of evidence there, but there is recent evidence from the Harvard Business Review, and there's also been a report that's come out this week from the the LGBT Foundation and NHS Confederation about the experience of transgender and non-binary staff in relation to aggressive behaviours, insensitivity, discrimination, and also the lack of reporting around incidents that happen in the workplace. So yeah, I'm interested to know your view on that in particular, in terms of, again, I think this probably comes back to what you've said around culture, and do people actually feel safe to probably share what they're experiencing? But also I'd be interested to know what your experiences has been of challenging some of the structures or some of the negative cultures perhaps that have existed within organisations. And I know that you have been involved in some work around the NHS and waiting times. So it'd be great to know kind of how some of these systems have been challenged, really, from what you've seen and done.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, gender diverse people really don't feel comfortable being in a workplace because they're incredibly vulnerable, and they feel that the entire workplace knows about their trans status. So the reason for giving them support and allowing them to know that they're supported is incredibly important. Now, like as you said, there are lots of statistics. There are lots of microaggressions happening in the workplace. And when we look at things like microaggressions, it's not just the one incident that really tips you overboard. It's, this ongoing culture where you're misgendered, for example. There's the lack of respect because of who you are. Well, we all need to remember we're there to do a job. We're not there to judge our colleagues or to judge the people around us, because they were hired to do a job, and they were hired simply because they are good and they're capable of doing that job. And we need to respect that. It's got nothing to do with sexuality, gender identity, religion, or anything like that. But it's true that, if you were to experience microaggressions, if you were to go to a line manager, you would feel silly reporting that, because it's like being back at school, telling on somebody, and we're supposed to be adults. There is that almost internalized transphobia where you can, is it just me? Do they have a point? What is it about me? And you kind of turn it inward. And this lack of reporting isn't just within the workplace. Working with the Crown Prosecution Service and various police forces, the LGBTQ plus community does not report hate crime enough. With a recent meeting I had with CPS down in London, the actual reporting percentage was ridiculously low. We're talking 1% in certain months. And when you look at somewhere like London, you think that can't be right. There can't be zero transphobic hate crimes in that particular month. And that's because I've experienced it myself, trying to report a hate crime, being misgendered on the phone when I'm trying to report it, having to explain or justify to the person why it's a hate crime, why I feel, very attacked by that, the reasons for somebody wanting to surround me after a night out, and it was a really dangerous situation where I was fearful for my life. If at that moment I think that person's not taking me seriously, why would I go ahead with reporting it? I just think, well, what's the point? They're not going to get me, and I don't. And with the LGBTQ plus community, things like Section 28, where police were traditionally quite heavy-handed in enforcing that, even right back to the Stonewall riots back in 1969, where there's police brutality. There has always been this division where the police aren't trusted, and that's the same with other marginalized groups as well. And because of that, we don't speak up. We just get on with things, but we hold everything in. All these negative experiences thrown at us, we just weather that storm, and we've become a community that just doesn't speak out when there are things that are thrown against us. But we need to, and when we do speak out, we need that support. We need someone to understand and to listen and to find a way forward with us. And again, it comes back to the culture, because, when you say to somebody, they've been misgendering me, you don't want to get that person into trouble. You're simply saying it from a place of, this is how it made me feel as a person.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to get on with my job. And if that person's misgendering you on purpose, which, statistically a lot of trans people find that does happen, then if it gets you down, it starts affecting your mental health. That's when it becomes a problem. So as employers, we need to take that seriously. We need to find that way forward. Staff training, awareness sessions, presentations, that is absolutely vital. But allow your employees to speak up by addressing, before you bringing an external speaker, ask internally, are there any trans members of staff? Are there any staff networks who would like to put a presentation together for the rest of the company? And let's talk openly. Let's really get to know each other. And then again, once we understand each other, we can come back together as a tight-knit team.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and I think as you were speaking through that, I think there's lots of things that we can do practically, but I'm interested in terms of advocacy, because I think it's challenging for any group when they're being marginalised or discriminated against to have the expectation that it's for them to then speak up and be the momentum to create that change. I think that there's a definite need for lived experience to be central to any movement within progress at work. But I do think that allyship and that advocacy needs to wrap around. It needs to come from beyond for it to be impactful and to create a situation where it's not too risky for those groups, those individuals to speak out, whether it's collectively or as an individual. Have you seen any good examples of advocacy within organisations where things have moved forward and it hasn't only solely relied on kind of members of the trans or non-binary community to actually raise that as an issue? Is that happening? Do you think we need to do more of that? Yeah.
Slowly and surely. And I think it comes from confidence, where people find that confidence to really stand up and say, I'm going to do something. I'm going to be that change. And one of my Instagram followers was telling me about a situation where she identified that there should be sanitary towel bins in every single toilet. They didn't have gender neutral toilets yet. So as a workaround, the cost is next to nothing. And by doing so, it will help a lot more people. Now, rather than speak for the trans community within the workplace, she basically held the door open. She approached HR and said, look, this is something that I've noticed. And I think you should speak to the trans and gender diverse people within our business to get their thoughts on it and work with them to find this way forward. And so she opened that door and invited, this situation, this dialogue to take place. And then she stepped away from it. And lo and behold, that policy was implemented. Sanitary towel bins were in every single toilet, and everyone, no one really batted an eyelid, but the people that it mattered most to, they noticed. Like, we notice the smallest of things. If I go to a restaurant and I see the server has pronouns in their name badge, I instantly relax because I instantly think, you understand the need for pronouns. I don't have to have this meal looking over my shoulder constantly. I can just have a meal. And those little gestures can go a long way towards saying, I see you and I hear you. Yeah, and that was fantastic. And that came from this person leaning into her own privilege, knowing that she had access to certain areas and spaces within the business more readily and more easily than a trans person would do, for example. And so she approached HR and set up this dialogue. So lean into what you have and recognize the privilege, because we all have a privilege. We all have access. What can we do to allow others that same privilege as well?
Love that. And that just speaks to the fact that there is a power, like you said, there is a power and a privilege within each and every one of us. And, it starts with a conversation. It starts with highlighting something, and then the ripple effect from there on can have a massive effect on not only the current generation, but also the organisation, the way that they attract people in the future as well. So it is, it's powerful. It's definitely worth doing, and let's try harder, I think, in terms of creating that catalyst and that movement. So thank you, for sharing that. And I think what I'd love to speak a bit more about now, because I think there are practical things, and there's loads of stuff that you've shared already in terms of what we can practically do to build a more inclusive culture in terms of changes within the workplace, for instance. I'm also interested in some of the more structural barriers, and I know that you did some work with some campaigning, I believe, with the NHS around structural issues, particularly around waiting times. Is there anything that you would want to share in relation to how do you actually challenge a structure that might be set up to exclude or to disadvantage certain groups? Is there a different approach to that if you're wanting to change something in a more long-term or structural way?
Yeah, I mean, we always look at, like, within the workplace, if you work there, it's, you have a privilege, you have a voice within that workplace.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to say, look, this is what I've identified. Let's talk about this. But yeah, you're right. When we look at the larger organizations, the larger structures, it's like a David and Goliath situation. With the NHS, for example, that ended up as legal action because it was a case of identifying a situation, speaking and trying to have that dialogue with them, and finding that they weren't very forthcoming with that dialogue. And that was born from the fact that the NHS, for any patient within the NHS, from when your GP refers you to a specialist treatment centre or clinician, for example, if you've got a bad back or mental health or anything like that, anything outside of the primary care setting, from the moment your GP refers you, you should have your first appointment within 18 weeks. That's the referral to treatment guidelines that they have. Well, with trans people, we fall well outside of that. So by this August, I'll have been waiting for 6 years for my first appointment at a gender clinic, and there's no end in sight for that waiting. There are currently about 28,000 patients in England alone waiting for a first appointment, with the average waiting times being about 5 years, and that's without any mental health support. So we identified this area where we needed to do more, because people, I lost a friend last year because they couldn't handle waiting. It was excruciating for them. So we need to do more for these people. I recognized that I was lucky enough to be able to go private to kind of kickstart my medical transition. But again, it's not about me. So I thought, well, that's what I can do for me. What can I now do for others who aren't as privileged? So there was talk of legal action and trying to get clarification on this 18-week referral to treatment. NHS was saying that it was a guideline over, it was a duty target. Whereas we were saying, well, actually it's a legal target, because what's the point of having this in place if there's no, responsibility to actually adhere to it? So this doesn't just impact trans people. Yes, the case starts from trans people, but also social injustices are interlinked. If we're successful in our case overall, this will impact every single user of the NHS, anybody that's been waiting more than 18 weeks for mental health care, to see a specialist clinician about that bad knee, bad back, or anything like that. Anybody who's been waiting more than 18 weeks will benefit from this. And we ended up going to the High Court for a judicial review. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in the first round at the High Court, but we have been granted a chance to appeal. So we'll be shortly attending the Court of Appeal. But it comes from this challenge where you recognize the greater good that this can do, because it's not just about trans people. This falling outside of the 18-week referral to treatment target is affecting so many people. And this was happening way before the pandemic. And it's not about frontline nurses or doctors. This is NHS England, the commissioning board, that make the decisions. It's about, is the right decision being made? It's not about funding. There's more than one way to spend the same amount of money. Are we doing it in a way that's efficient? Are we making decisions that are efficient? So that came from my personal desire to want to create change on a bigger scale, and getting involved and recognizing, well, how do we tackle such a big entity? And working with the Good Law Project, we found that through legal means, because sometimes you can only be heard if you go down the legal route. Sometimes you can speak to your own MP and kind of lobby them to kind of help you and do it that way around. So it's taking a step back and recognizing, what is the ultimate goal? How do we start this? What will we need? Who will we need on our side along this journey? Now, with the NHS, it was very much down the litigation route, because this whole thing was rooted in legislation. So we needed to go down that route. If it's something like an issue with your GP, NHS has its guidelines. You can speak to your GP yourself. And indeed, if you were to make a complaint, all organizations have a formal complaints procedure. Beyond that, there's, the ombudsman, for example. So it's finding your angle of attack, your strategy. What are my means to open that dialogue? And if that dialogue stalls, what else do I have behind me that I can then use as well. So a lot of it comes down to how far are you willing to push this? How much do you want that change that you will exhaust absolutely everything to see that happen?
Mm. And it sounds like that probably was quite an exhausting and draining process going through that. So I suppose there's an element of personal sacrifice, I would imagine, in terms of making the change happen. But again, it's not just one person can't make the change. I guess it's looking at what support, like you said, what support, what allies do you have, what stakeholders that you have to get on board to support you with that. And I know there's a number of organisations up and down the UK that support issues like this. So it's like how do you actually connect in with the people who might help you on that process as well? But I think the challenging thing is when we look at any area of EDI, but particularly when we look at kind of transgender and non-binary, is that, you know, the Equality Act is there, like you've already alluded to. It's a really comprehensive piece of legislation that protects people with protected characteristics legally. So I think, you know, it's good to start a conversation and to see how far you can go with that conversation. But sometimes to make change happen and to change the future, we have to have quite difficult conversations and take things a step further, really. So it's interesting, and obviously we'll be following what happens with that as it goes on. It's the only way, unfortunately, to change the change processes, really, to provide that challenge. So thank you for sharing that. That's useful.
No worries.
Okay, so we're almost at the end. I told you it would fly, didn't I?
Yeah, it definitely does.
So we usually wrap up, and I think there is a question that's come through, so I'll check that in a sec. But we usually wrap up with some practical advice from your perspective. If there was one call for action for people within this community around how to elevate the transgender community within the workplace, is there a particular thing that you would want us to, as a key takeaway, to take away with us?
Yeah, I would say for like the most important thing is communication. Speak to your trans non-binary colleagues, ask them what it is that they need. And even if it's nothing, they hear you, they see, and they know you're there with support readily. And keep that conversation, keep that dialogue going, because when, you know, employees are in need, they won't necessarily put the hand up and say straight away. So it's recognizing the little changes within your own culture, that if somebody's unhappy, what can you do to address that? We're a family, so let's look out for each other. And if you are able to step in, if you hear that, you know, somebody's talking about trans people because they've heard something on the news and you know it's not right, just say, well, actually, you know, statistically it's this and this. Challenge it, put an end to it, because otherwise that misinformation will spread, and the person who really suffers is that trans employee who feels like they've got no allies, nobody willing to speak up for them. And you can understand, you know, what is right and what isn't right by engaging with the trans community, whether it's on social media or whether it's through EDI presentations and webinars and things like that, by asking those questions. Once you know what is right and what's wrong, it makes you a better ally straight away, and you're more empowered. You'll find that confidence to be able to intervene.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that education piece, coming from a place of informed knowledge, is powerful for confidence. So we have had a question from Mira. So Mira, thank you for your question. Amira's starting an LGBT staff group in a local authority, and she'd be interested to know, Eva, what do you think is the most important issues to add to the agenda and objectives to attract more people to join the group and actually start these discussions?
First of all, that's amazing that, you know, this is happening. So well done for starting it. To attract people to the group, openness and honesty, and say, look, this is why we're starting this network, and invite people to come on board and let them know that this is their chance to be heard. Because once you've got that buy-in, people understand that, you know, this is really something that they can use to create change. You'll have loads of people. You'll be inundated with people wanting to get involved, and then use that as a vehicle to allow people to be heard, allow people to come through and say, well, you know, these are the issues affecting me. This is my lived experience, and you move forward as a network together, having each other's backs. So yeah, it's great. Make sure that you've got, you know, voices from right across the board as well. You know, not just the protected characteristics. Don't go for a tick box. Go for intersectionality. Let's look at a wide cross section of your workplace, because as people in that job, you know that workplace more than anybody else. So you're in the best position to be able to challenge and create that change from internally.
Thank you. What a great answer. I think it's refreshing just to get that as a starting point, because I think it can be quite overwhelming trying to start a network. But like you say,
Definitely.
Once you get started, and if you start on the right foot, then you're setting up for success there. So, thank you so much, Eva. The time has flown. I knew it would, but I really, really appreciate you sharing about yourself, sharing about your journey, what you've been doing. Really, really fascinating and very, very motivating in terms of what we can all do really to advance this really important equality agenda for the transgender community. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks everyone else as well who has joined the call. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've just popped a link in the chat. You will be getting a survey. It'd be really useful to get your feedback on how the session was. And we're looking at how we can change the format for next year as well to make it a bit more interactive. And yeah, we hope you can join us again for our next session. It'll be on the 28th of September and we'll be joined by Lee Chambers, and I'll pop some information up on the slides now. But enjoy the rest of your afternoon and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.